My phone started ringing before the sun came up. By the time I pulled on my boots and stepped outside, the air in the parking lot already smelled like cold metal and diesel. 3 of my work trucks sat frozen in place. Bright orange violation stickers slapped across the windshields like warning labels. A tow truck idled nearby, its engine humming, while 2 HOA compliance contractors stood there with clipboards, avoiding eye contact. The HOA head was waiting for me. He said the trucks were commercial eyesores under a newly enforced rule, not unsafe, not illegal, just bad for the neighborhood's long-term value. He talked about curb appeal, investor interest, and how serious buyers didn't want to see heavy equipment when they toured the area. I told him those trucks kept my business alive, that they were legally parked, that they serviced infrastructure all over the county. He nodded like he was listening, then handed me the citation with a thin, sympathetic smile. "It's just policy, neighbor," he said. "I'm sure you can afford to park them elsewhere. You look like you're doing well." My employees stood there in disbelief. Neighbors cracked their doors, watching. A full day of work was already gone. As the tow driver reached for his chains, it hit me. This wasn't about rules. It was about money and appearances. They thought they were cutting off my livelihood. They had no idea what they'd just started. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I first moved into that neighborhood, it felt like I'd finally earned some quiet. It was semi-rural, spread out just enough that mornings were calm and nights stayed dark. You could hear trucks on the highway miles away, but inside the community everything felt slow and orderly. At the time, my logistics and construction support business was just starting to hit its stride. Nothing glamorous, long hours, dirty work. My boots always smelled like diesel no matter how many times I washed them. That smell followed me everywhere. Pumps, heavy haulers, backup generators. It was the smell of infrastructure, the kind that keeps a county running but never gets thanked. The trucks weren't status symbols. They were tools. They hauled materials for road repairs, supported emergency response jobs when storms hit, and kept seasonal crews moving when everyone else shut down. I parked them neatly, kept them clean, and never blocked anyone. Most neighbors didn't mind. Some even appreciated it. After bad weather, when drainage cleared faster or roads reopened sooner, people would nod like they understood, even if they never said it out loud. The HOA back then barely mattered. They sent out generic emails, collected dues, and stayed out of the way. It felt more like paperwork than authority. I figured as long as I followed the basics, we'd never have a problem. That changed when leadership changed. The new HOA head showed up polished in a way that felt rehearsed. He talked a lot about long-term value and market positioning. He wasn't obsessed with rules so much as optics. He mentioned property values constantly, especially how the neighborhood needed to look if it was ever going to attract the right kind of buyer. Developers, investors, people with money. The trucks, he said once in passing, sent the wrong signal. At first, it was subtle. Friendly emails about parking concern, vague complaints about noise on days my trucks never moved, anonymous messages forwarded through the HOA claiming residents felt uneasy seeing commercial vehicles. I didn't argue. I adjusted. I moved trucks when asked. I shuffled schedule. I showed up to meeting, sat quietly, and spoke respectfully when it was my turn. I wanted peace more than I wanted to be right. Some neighbors noticed what was happening before I did. They'd catch me outside and lower their voices, like they were sharing gossip they didn't want traced back to them. They said the HOA head had been talking about cleaning up the community for years, that he saw businesses as temporary, messy things that dragged values down. One neighbor said he'd overheard him talking about courting a high-end buyer who wanted the place to look purely residential. I brushed it off. I told myself people exaggerate. I'd been there for years. I paid my dues. I wasn't going anywhere. Meanwhile, life went on. Most mornings, I'd wave to the landscaping crews as they worked their way through the neighborhood. I knew a lot of them by name. Half of them filled up at my pumps on the other side of town before sunrise every day. We'd nod at each other, exchange a few words, then get on with work. It all felt normal, connected. Then the tone shifted. Warnings turned sharper. The HOA head stopped pretending to be friendly when we crossed paths. He'd smile for others, then look straight through me. That same night, an email would land in my inbox questioning whether my operations aligned with the future vision of the community. I asked for clarification. I got nothing specific back. The rule change came quietly. It was buried in the minutes of an HOA update email, a single paragraph about amended vehicle guidelines, approved during a sparsely attended meeting. No explanation, no direct notice, just a line stating that commercial vehicles were now under review for compliance. I told myself it wouldn't apply to me. The trucks had been there for years. They were legal. They weren't hurting anyone. Reason would win. The formal notice arrived a week later. Clean letterhead, professional language, cold tone. All commercial vehicles were now classified as restricted. Enforcement effective immediately. No mention of grandfathering. No appeal process outlined. Just compliance demanded. I stood there reading it again and again, feeling that tight pressure settle into my chest. The wording was deliberate, prepared. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a neighborhood complaint finally bubbling over. It was a decision, and for the first time since I'd moved there, I understood that the ground under my feet had shifted on purpose, and whatever came next was going to be aimed straight at me. I didn't wait. The morning after the notice arrived, I drove straight to the HOA office and asked to speak to the HOA head in person. I brought the letter with me, folded and creased from being read too many times. I laid it on his desk and asked him to explain how a rule slipped into an email could suddenly shut down a business that had operated there for years. He glanced at the paper, then pushed it aside. He told me the language was intentionally broad. That flexibility was important when a community was trying to protect its future value. I pointed out that county zoning allowed my trucks, that nothing about my operation had changed, and that identical vehicles sat in driveways all over the neighborhood without a single sticker on them. He smiled, the way someone does when they think you're missing the point. Zoning, he said, didn't matter inside a private community. Optics did. He talked about investor walkthroughs, about first impressions, about how commercial equipment suggested instability. I asked why enforcement only started now. He said complaints had come in. When I asked who complained, he said confidentiality prevented disclosure. Then he added that there were sometimes ways to smooth things out. Additional assessments, community impact fees. He never asked outright, but the message was clear. I told him my dues paid for the roads and my taxes paid for the zoning. I wasn't paying a dime extra for a sticker. That's when the fines started. The first one showed up 2 days later, then another, then 3 more, each citing a different clause, each timed just far enough apart to feel intentional. My employees started calling me, saying HOA contractors were circling the lot early in the morning, taking pictures from every angle. One of my drivers said security questioned him about where he worked and warned him that parking near my trucks could cause complications. A neighbor knocked on my door that evening. He looked uncomfortable, eyes darting like he didn't want to be seen. He told me the HOA was offering reduced dues and gift cards to anyone who reported violations tied to my vehicles, photos, time, name. He said he felt sick just repeating it. I filed appeals anyway, carefully, professionally. I cited bylaws. I referenced zoning ordinances. I included photos of similar vehicles parked elsewhere with no enforcement attached. I asked for hearing. I asked for written explanations. Every appeal came back denied. No reason, no signatures, just stamped decisions and new fines added on top. The pressure crept into everything. I started waking up early just to check on the trucks. I stayed up late watching camera feeds. Conversations stopped when I walked through the neighborhood. People I used to nod at suddenly avoided eye contact. At the next HOA meeting, I tried once more to speak. I stood up, kept my voice steady, and asked why rules were being enforced selectively. The HOA head didn't let me finish. He cut me off, said the issue was settled, and warned me not to disrupt official proceedings again. That was the moment I stopped thinking this could be fixed with reason. 2 nights later, a notice appeared on my door just after dark. Thicker paper, legal language. It announced an emergency enforcement sweep scheduled for the following week. All restricted vehicles would be subject to immediate action. Towing, immobilization, additional penalty. Only one address was listed, mine. I stood there holding the paper, feeling the last illusion of fairness drain away. They weren't hiding behind process anymore. They were putting pressure where it would hurt most, confident they could force me to fold. That's when I realized this wasn't about compliance at all. It was about making an example. The pressure stopped pretending to be subtle. The morning after the enforcement notice, I walked out and found my trucks boxed in like someone had planned it with a ruler. 2 HOA maintenance vehicles were parked inches from the bumpers, close enough that even trying to maneuver would have caused damage. No cone, no notices, just obstruction. I called the number on the side of one of the vehicles and was told it was a temporary positioning issue and someone would look into it. No one ever did. By mid-morning, my crews were standing around with nothing to do. Contracts don't wait for HOA politics. Missed starts turn into missed deadlines, and missed deadlines turn into lost trust. I could feel it slipping, job by job. Then the fuel access issue hit. The shared service gate was locked without warning. Cards that had worked for years suddenly declined. When one of my drivers tried to access a pump he'd used hundreds of times, HOA security showed up and threatened him with a trespassing citation. He called me from the cab, voice tight, asking if he was about to lose his license for doing what he'd always done. Clients started calling next, not angry at first, concerned, then impatient. A municipal contact warned me, carefully, that repeated failures could jeopardize future contracts. I heard something else underneath his words, doubt, like reliability was already being rewritten by someone who wasn't me. I went to the next HOA meeting because I still believed there was a line they wouldn't cross in public. I was wrong. I barely finished my first sentence before the room turned on me. People talked over each other, repeating phrases I recognized from HOA email. The HOA head stood and took control instantly. He accused me of injecting industrial chaos into a residential investment. He said my trucks hurt property value. He said families didn't move there to live next to a business. When I tried to respond, he pointed at me and told security I was being disruptive. They escorted me out of the room like I didn't belong there. I remember the sound of the door closing behind me, the way it echoed in the hallway. I stood there for a moment staring at the wall, breathing through the surge of anger and disbelief. That was the moment it stopped feeling like a dispute and started feeling like exile. At home, the stress followed me inside. Sleep came in fragments. I woke at every sound. Any headlights slowing near the house made my stomach tighten. My family started asking questions I couldn't answer yet. Dinners went quiet. The house felt smaller, like the walls were listening. I installed cameras everywhere I legally could, not to escalate, to survive. 2 nights later, they gave me what I needed. The footage was clean, clear enough that there was no ambiguity. 2 HOA agents after midnight, wearing reflective vests like legitimacy, could be put on and taken off. One leaned over a truck and unscrewed the fuel cap. The other twisted a valve just enough to cause problems later. No paperwork, no report, just interference. I watched it 3 times before I trusted my own eyes. This wasn't enforcement. It wasn't policy. It was sabotage. I didn't confront anyone. I documented everything instead. Timestamps, multiple backups, still frames, logged. I stopped reacting emotionally and started thinking structurally. That shift mattered. The certified letter arrived the next afternoon. Heavy envelope, legal tone, polite wording hiding sharp edges. It outlined accumulated fines and informed me that continued non-compliance would result in lien placement against my property. It included language about forced removal of all restricted vehicles. 7 days. I set the letter on the kitchen table and stared at it longer than I want to admit. 7 days before they could touch my house, my business, everything I'd built. They weren't bluffing anymore. They weren't testing boundaries. They were executing a plan they believed I couldn't stop. What they didn't understand was that by tampering with equipment they didn't control, they crossed out of HOA territory and into something much bigger. And for the first time since this started, the fear faded. In its place was focus. I didn't sleep much after that letter, but it wasn't panic keeping me awake anymore. It was calculation. Every time I replayed the footage in my head, the same thought kept surfacing. They hadn't just harassed me. They'd touched equipment they had no authority over. And that changed everything. Sometime before dawn, I called my old business partner. We hadn't talked in years, not because anything went wrong, but because life moved on. He answered groggy, then fully awake the moment I said my name. I walked him through it from the beginning, the rule change, the fines, the blocked trucks, the footage of the fuel caps and valves. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long stretch of silence on the line. Then he asked a single question, calm and practical. Who's the primary vendor for the HOA's snow removal contract? I hadn't thought about it in those terms yet. I pulled up the vendor list the HOA published every year. Landscaping, maintenance, snow removal, green line services. I said the name out loud. He let out a short laugh, not amused, more like someone recognizing a pattern. Greenline buys about 80% of their diesel from us, he said. Check the force majeure and safety clauses. I opened the contracts immediately, not just Greenlines, all of them. Landscaping, emergency generators, maintenance fleet. Every agreement tied back to the same place, my depot. Same licenses, same compliance structure, same safety language. And there it was, clear as day. If fuel system integrity was compromised by unauthorized third-party interference, access had to be suspended pending a full safety audit. No discretion, no exception, no timeline promised. Weeks, sometimes longer. I leaned back in my chair and felt the weight of it settle. This wasn't leverage I'd forgotten about. It was responsibility I'd taken on years earlier and never needed to use like this. If contaminated fuel caused a generator failure during a storm or damaged a contractor's equipment, that liability would land squarely on me, not the HOA, not their agents, me. They'd forced my hand. I wasn't shutting anything down to make a point. I was following the rules exactly as written, the same way they kept telling me to. For the first time in days, I smiled. Not out of satisfaction, but out of clarity. The ground hadn't shifted under me after all. I'd just been standing on something bigger than they realized. I looped my partner back in, and we went line by line, making sure there were no shortcuts, no emotional language, no room for interpretation. This wasn't retaliation, it was compliance. Strict, boring, unavoidable. I called counsel next, laid out the footage, the interference, the clauses, the timeline. The answer didn't change. You suspend access, he said. You document why, and you don't deviate. By late afternoon, I walked through the depot myself. The steady hum of pumps, the smell of diesel hanging in the air, trucks coming and going like they always had. This place wasn't just part of my business, it was infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't bend for neighborhood politics. Before sunset, I gave the instruction. Prepare the suspension notice. Formal language. Safety justification only. No mention of the HOA by name. Effective immediately, pending completion of a mandatory audit triggered by unauthorized tampering. When I hung up, I felt something lift that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. They still thought this was about parking spots and appearances. They still believed pressure flowed in one direction. They were about to learn the difference between power and dependency. And this time, I wouldn't need to raise my voice at all. Once the notices went out, I stopped guessing and started documenting everything like I was already on the witness stand. I organized the footage into a clean timeline. Dates, timestamps, camera angles, the blocked trucks, the late-night tampering, the threats made to my drivers. Every file was labeled, duplicated, and stored off-site. Nothing dramatic, just facts stacked neatly, the way regulators and lawyers like them. I made one call to the county safety office, not to complain, but to report a compromised fuel system. That wording mattered. When I explained that unauthorized individuals had interfered with valves tied to licensed fuel transfers, the tone on the other end shifted immediately. They didn't ask me how I felt. They asked for documentation. I sent it. Within an hour, I had written confirmation advising me not to resume service to any affected contractors until a full audit cleared the systems. That was all I needed. The suspension notices landed quietly. No public announcement, no accusations. Each contractor received the same language. Access temporarily suspended due to documented safety interference pending mandatory audit under existing agreements. I didn't single anyone out. I didn't argue. I complied. The neighborhood felt the impact faster than I expected. The next morning, the landscaping crews didn't show up. Lawns went untouched. By the afternoon, maintenance requests backed up. A resident stopped me on the sidewalk asking why the community center generator hadn't been serviced ahead of an incoming storm. I told him I didn't know. That wasn't a lie, By day 2, things escalated. Trash pickups were delayed. Snow equipment sat idle despite a weather advisory. Contractors stopped answering HOA emails altogether. They weren't being stubborn. They were protecting their warranties, their licenses, and their insurance. No fuel meant no work, and no work meant angry clients. The HOA message board lit up. Questions turned into complaints. Complaints turned into demands. People weren't talking about my trucks anymore. They were talking about why basic services had suddenly fallen apart. That's when my phone started buzzing. The first voicemail from the HOA head was stiff and controlled. He said there had been a misunderstanding and suggested we talk privately to clear things up. The second message came an hour later, shorter and sharper, asking why vendors were refusing to operate. By the third, the tone cracked. He accused me of retaliation. He said I was abusing my position. He warned me about legal consequences. Then, without realizing it, he did something important. He admitted they'd handled the vehicle situation aggressively. I saved the message. Over the next 2 days, the calls kept coming. Offers appeared where threats used to be. Temporary exemptions, emergency allowances, promises to revisit enforcement. The same flexibility he'd denied me before suddenly existed when it affected everyone else. I didn't respond to any of it. Meanwhile, the contractors started talking. One called me directly, furious, but not at me. He said the HOA had pressured them to falsify reports about my trucks to justify enforcement. Another admitted they'd been assured fuel access would resume if they cooperated. None of them were willing to put that in writing for the HOA anymore. The pressure had flipped directions. Regulatory emails began circulating quietly. Notices of pending audits, requests for documentation from vendors, reminders about safety compliance. Nothing dramatic, nothing public, but enough to make everyone involved very nervous. By the end of the week, the neighborhood felt tense in a new way, not hostile, uncertain. People avoided the HOA office. Conversations stalled when someone mentioned contracts or vendors. The illusion of smooth management was gone, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that the system they relied on was fragile. Late Friday afternoon, a notice appeared in every inbox and on every door. Emergency community meeting. Mandatory attendance encouraged. Purpose: resolution of the vehicle issue and restoration of services. The wording made me pause. Not safety, not audits, not vendor compliant vehicles. They still believed this was about trucks. I stood in my driveway that evening watching one of my rigs roll out on a job that hadn't been canceled, listening to another voicemail go unanswered. The HOA was scrambling now, trying to pull control back into their hands before residents realized where the fault actually lay. They wanted a meeting because meetings were where they'd always held power. What they didn't understand was that by now, the story was no longer theirs to tell. And once people started comparing notes in the same room, there would be no way to put it back the way it was. The parking lot outside the meeting hall was packed in a way I'd never seen before. Cars lined both sides of the street, engines still ticking as people climbed out, already arguing in low, sharp voices. This wasn't an HOA crowd looking for updates. This was a crowd that wanted answers. Inside, every seat was filled. People stood along the walls and in the back, arms crossed, faces tight with frustration. Landscaping crews were there, maintenance supervisors, a couple of contractors I recognized from early mornings at my depot. The mood wasn't hostile yet, but it was charged, like something waiting to snap. I took a seat near the back and said nothing. The HOA head stepped up front and wasted no time. He didn't start with the trucks. He started with the fallout, missed services, delayed maintenance, concerns about emergency preparedness. He spoke like a man trying to hold together a dam with words, presenting himself as calm leadership in a crisis. Then he turned it toward me. He said the disruption was intentional, that a single resident had decided to abuse his business position to force the HOA's hand. He said I was retaliating because I didn't like the rules. He said I was holding the neighborhood hostage to protect my own interests. Murmurs rippled through the room. Residents started speaking up. overgrown lawn, trash delays. A woman asked what would happen if the power went out and the generators weren't fueled. A man wanted to know why snow equipment hadn't been staged yet with winter coming. Each concern landed hard, and each time the HOA head nodded gravely and pointed back at me. He framed it simply: remove the problem, restore order. Then he laid out his solution: an emergency vote to permanently remove my trucks from the community. No grace period, no appeal, immediate enforcement. He said vendors would return the moment the neighborhood looked compliant again. I stayed seated. I let the idea hang in the air. I watched people consider it. I understood why it sounded tempting. The trucks were visible. The fuel lines weren't. To most of them, this looked like a clean fix to a messy situation. The HOA head pushed the momentum. He talked about values again, about optics, about how investors didn't tolerate uncertainty. He said decisive action was the only way forward. When he called for the vote, I stood. The room quieted in a way that felt physical, like pressure shifting. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The HOA head's expression tightened, irritation flashing before he replaced it with that same practiced calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue with his framing. I didn't accuse him of anything. I told them that fuel access had been suspended under existing safety clauses, not as punishment, but because unauthorized interference made continued operation a liability. I explained that once system integrity was compromised, audits weren't optional. They were mandatory. No exceptions for inconvenience, no shortcuts for appearances. Then I said something that finally broke the narrative he'd built. I said I hadn't brought regulators to the meeting, but I had brought their findings. I held up the letter, not waved it, just held it long enough for people in the front rows to lean forward and read the heading: Cease and desist. Safety violations, pending audits. The room shifted again. Before the HOA head could respond, someone spoke from the back. It was the owner of the landscaping company. I recognized his voice before I saw him stand. He looked exhausted, angry, done. He didn't cut us off, he said, pointing past the HOA head toward me. You did. Your people messed with the tanks. We saw the footage. I'm not voiding a six-figure equipment warranty for your property value experiment. Another contractor stood up, then another, each one telling the same story in different words: pressure, assurances, promises that fuel would come back if they cooperated. None of them willing to keep playing along now that their livelihoods were on the line. The HOA head tried to speak, but the room wouldn't give him the space anymore. The authority he'd relied on was dissolving, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a slow, undeniable loss of belief. I sat back down. The vote never happened, because suddenly this wasn't about trucks or appearances or rules anymore. It was about who had caused the damage and who had been quietly keeping everything running until it broke. And for the first time since this all started, the room understood the difference. The room didn't erupt, it tightened. People weren't shouting yet. They were processing. You could feel it in the way bodies leaned forward, in the way eyes stopped bouncing between speakers and locked onto the HOA head instead. The story he'd been feeding them for weeks had just cracked, and everyone was testing it, pressing on the weak spots to see if it would hold. It didn't. The HOA head tried to regain control. He raised his hands and said things had been taken out of context. He said contractors misunderstood instruction. He said the situation had escalated beyond what anyone intended. The words came fast now, overlapping, defensive, not confident, not guiding, just trying to survive the moment. The landscaping owner didn't sit back down. He pulled out his phone and held it up. "This is your compliance guy," he said, voice steady but shaking underneath. "This is him at 1 a.m, opening a fuel cap. I got sent this before sunrise because your office told us we'd better get aligned or lose access." A murmur rolled through the room, darker this time. Another contractor stood, then another. One talked about being asked to sign a report stating my trucks were leaking. Another said he'd been told the HOA would smooth things over with fuel vendors if he cooperated. None of them were yelling. They didn't need to. Every sentence sounded expensive. Residents started asking questions, not at me, but at the board. Why were private contractors being pressured? Why were safety systems touched at all? Who authorized that? The HOA head looked to the other board members. No one met his eye. That's when I stood again. I didn't add anything dramatic. I didn't play more footage. I didn't accuse. I simply placed the cease and desist letter on the table at the front and slid it forward so people could see it clearly. County letterhead, safety violation notice, mandatory audits, pending. I told them I hadn't asked for special treatment. I hadn't shut anyone down out of spite. Once the footage existed, once the interference was documented, my contracts didn't give me a choice. Continuing service would have violated the same safety rules I'd been licensed under for years. If a generator fails, I said calmly, or a piece of equipment gets damaged because someone tampered with a valve, that liability doesn't land on the HOA. It lands on me. That landed harder than anything else. People understood liability. They understood responsibility. They understood that what had been framed as a personal dispute was actually about risk they'd all been dragged into without knowing. The room turned. A resident stood up near the aisle and said she'd been offered a reduction in dues to submit complaints about my truck. Another admitted the same. Someone else said they'd been told the neighborhood needed to look clean for potential investors, and that enforcement was temporary until a deal closed. Every word peeled something back. The HOA had tried one last time to assert authority. He talked about leadership, about order, about how none of this would have happened if I'd just complied from the beginning. His voice rose, sharp and strained, echoing off the walls. It only made it worse. Someone called for a pause. Another person demanded an explanation vote. A third asked why the board hadn't disclosed any of this earlier. The questions started coming from everywhere now, overlapping, uncontrolled. This wasn't a mob. It was something more dangerous to someone like him. It was consensus forming without him. A motion was made from the floor to remove him as HOA head pending investigation. It didn't come from me. It didn't need to. The board members looked at each other, pale and cornered. One tried to argue for procedure. Another shook his head. When the vote was called, hands went up fast, too fast. It passed, just like that. Security didn't drag him out. No one needed to. He stepped away from the podium on his own, shoulders slumped, the confidence gone so completely it was hard to believe he'd ever stood there so comfortably. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked exposed. As people filed out of the room, the conversations weren't loud. They were focused. Contractors exchanged numbers. Residents asked questions they should have asked months ago. Board members spoke quietly with attorneys on their phones. Nothing exploded. Something collapsed. By the time I walked outside, the night felt different, lighter, like pressure had finally vented instead of bursting. The enforcement campaign was over. The story had changed hands, and investigations weren't coming because someone stormed a room. They were coming because too many people had now seen too much to ignore. The HOA head thought control came from authority. That night proved it actually came from truth, and once that was out, there was no putting it back. The room didn't erupt, it tightened. People weren't shouting yet. They were processing. You could feel it in the way bodies leaned forward, in the way eyes stopped bouncing between speakers and locked onto the HOA head instead. The story he'd been feeding them for weeks had just cracked, and everyone was testing it, pressing on the weak spots to see if it would hold. It didn't. The HOA head tried to regain control. He raised his hands and said things had been taken out of context. He said contractors misunderstood instruction. He said the situation had escalated beyond what anyone intended. The words came fast now, overlapping, defensive, not confident, not guiding, just trying to survive the moment. The landscaping owner didn't sit back down. He pulled out his phone and held it up. "This is your compliance guy," he said, voice steady but shaking underneath. "This is him at 1 in the morning, opening the fuel cap. I got sent this before sunrise because your office told us we'd better get aligned or lose access." A murmur rolled through the room, darker this time. Another contractor stood, then another. One talked about being asked to sign a report stating my trucks were leaking. Another said he'd been told the HOA would smooth things over with fuel vendors if he cooperated. None of them were yelling. They didn't need to. Every sentence sounded expensive. Residents started asking questions, not at me, but at the board. Why were private contractors being pressured? Why were safety systems touched at all? Who authorized that? The HOA head looked to the other board members. No one met his eye. That's when I stood again. I didn't add anything dramatic. I didn't play more footage. I didn't accuse. I simply placed the cease and desist letter on the table at the front and slid it forward so people could see it clearly. County letterhead, safety violation notice, mandatory audits, pending. I told them I hadn't asked for special treatment. I hadn't shut anyone down out of spite. Once the footage existed, once the interference was documented, my contracts didn't give me a choice. Continuing service would have violated the same safety rules I'd been licensed under for years. If a generator fails, I said calmly, or a piece of equipment gets damaged because someone tampered with a valve, that liability doesn't land on the HOA. It lands on me. That landed harder than anything else. People understood liability. They understood responsibility. They understood that what had been framed as a personal dispute was actually about risk they'd all been dragged into without knowing. The room turned. A resident stood up near the aisle and said she'd been offered a reduction in dues to submit complaints about my truck. Another admitted the same. Someone else said they'd been told the neighborhood needed to look clean for potential investors, and that enforcement was temporary until a deal closed. Every word peeled something back. The HOA had tried one last time to assert authority. He talked about leadership, about order, about how none of this would have happened if I'd just complied from the beginning. His voice rose, sharp and strained, echoing off the walls. It only made it worse. Someone called for a pause. Another person demanded an explanation vote. A third asked why the board hadn't disclosed any of this earlier. The questions started coming from everywhere now, overlapping, uncontrolled. This wasn't a mob. It was something more dangerous to someone like him. It was consensus forming without him. A motion was made from the floor to remove him as HOA head pending investigation. It didn't come from me. It didn't need to. The board members looked at each other, pale and cornered. One tried to argue for procedure. Another shook his head. When the vote was called, hands went up fast, too fast. It passed, just like that. Security didn't drag him out. No one needed to. He stepped away from the podium on his own, shoulders slumped, the confidence gone so completely it was hard to believe he'd ever stood there so comfortably. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked exposed. As people filed out of the room, the conversations weren't loud. They were focused. Contractors exchanged numbers. Residents asked questions they should have asked months ago. Board members spoke quietly with attorneys on their phones. Nothing exploded. Something collapsed. By the time I walked outside, the night felt different, lighter, like pressure had finally vented instead of bursting. The enforcement campaign was over. The story had changed hands, and investigations weren't coming because someone stormed a room. They were coming because too many people had now seen too much to ignore. The HOA head thought control came from authority. That night proved it actually came from truth. And once that was out, there was no putting it back.